On the farthest edge of the galaxy there was a quiet world named Theron, a place small and unremarkable to the mighty empires of the stars, yet for its people it was home, a world of golden plains, stretching beyond the horizon of great mountains, carved by ancient winds, and of rivers that once fed fertile valleys. But Theron had begun to change. Its soil grew thin, and crops no longer thrived. The rains fell less each season, and the skies cracked with storms that ruined what little remained. People of Theron were not warriors nor conquerors. They were farmers, miners, and builders. They believed that when disaster struck there would be mercy among the stars, for had the stories not said, the galaxy was full of civilizations older and wiser than their own. They trusted that help would come when their voices were raised, and so they built great transmitters on the high ridges and sent their words into the void, signals of plea and desperation, messages carried on every frequency they could reach. At first they believed the silence was only distance. They told themselves the messages had not yet reached the right ears. They said the powers of the galaxy were preparing fleets and aid, and surely within months help would descend upon them. But months stretched into years, and still the skies remained empty, and the people grew thinner, weaker, hungrier. Children asked why the stars did not answer, and mothers gave no reply, for what answer could be given when your world was dying, and no hand came to lift you? Fathers searched the skies each night, staring at the faint lights above, whispering prayers to civilizations they had never met, but whom they had once believed to be kind and just. The great cities of Theron began to crumble without trade, without fuel, without fueled. Riots tore through streets once alive with markets and laughter. The strong preyed upon the weak, and yet still above the chaos, the transmitters blazed their signal, never ending, their voice echoing in endless night. Their call said, "We are dying, our children are starving, our world is failing, and we ask for aid from any who can hear." In time, despair grew into a bitter truth. The galaxy had heard and chosen to remain silent. The empires of wealth and power saw Theron not as a people worth saving, but as a burden not worth the cost. And so the cries of an entire planet faded into background noise, a tragedy dismissed as the fate of the weak. Yet still the people called, because to remain silent was to surrender. And though they felt abandoned, they believed in the faintest chance that somewhere someone would listen and answer. And so the voice of Theron carried on through the void, unanswered but never extinguished. The skies of Theron grew darker with each passing year, as if the heavens themselves had turned away from the suffering of its people. The once fertile plains cracked into dust, the rivers shrank into shallow streams, and the forests thinned until they stood as skeletal reminders of what had been. Whole generations were born into hunger and despair, never knowing the abundance their ancestors had spoken of in stories told around dim fires. The ruling councils tried to hold order, but with each year their words carried less weight. The people who once trusted in government now trusted only in survival, and survival was slipping through their hands. The cities grew desperate, markets became places of theft and violence, and the countryside became dangerous as roaming bands searched for whatever scraps remained. Every night the transmitters still roared into the void, their towers powered by scavenged reactors that coughed and flickered yet clung to life. They sent their message in every language they knew, in every code they could imagine, repeating their plea to the stars: "We are dying, we are starving, we are forgotten. Someone, please come to us." But no answer came, only static, only silence, and in that silence the despair grew sharper, like a knife cutting at the spirit of the people. Whispers began to spread that perhaps they had been cursed, or perhaps the galaxy itself had already judged them unworthy. Among the people of Theron were elders who remembered the old days, when the first signals had been sent, when hope had filled every heart. They remembered how families had gathered on rooftops to watch the sky, believing ships would descend with medicine and food. Those elders now watched their grandchildren starve, and their hope was ash in their mouths. The powerful nations of the galaxy had indeed heard the calls and dismissed them. Theron was a world with no riches to offer, no strategic position to guard, no fleets to strengthen. Its people were considered fragile and weak, too delicate to withstand the harsh winds of survival in a galaxy that prized strength above compassion. To answer their call would be to spend resources for nothing in return. So the decision was made in silence, and the silence was deadly. There were those on Theron who refused to give up, who spoke boldly that someone would come, even if it was Not an empire, but a lone wanderer, even if it was not today but tomorrow or next year. They refused to let the transmitters fall. Silent because to stop calling was to die not only in body but in spiriton. So night after night, the people of Theron lifted their eyes to the cold heavens above. They stared at the stars that seemed so close and yet so distant. Stars that glittered, with the promise of civilizations they would never meet, and still they called, still they cried into the darkness, and though no answer came, they would not surrender their voice. The years turned heavy upon Theron, and the weight of silence pressed on every heart, as though the stars themselves had grown deaf to suffering, yet the transmitters still burned against the void. They were monuments of desperation, towers that rose above ruins, their lights flickering like dying beacons, calling to anyone who might care to listen. The engineers who kept them alive worked with hands worn raw, scavenging parts from broken machines and abandoned factories, holding them together with stubborn resolve, because even if no one answered, to let the signals fade would mean surrender. As the famine deepened, the people divided. Some clung to faith in unseen allies, while others cursed the heavens for abandoning them. Many grew bitter, saying no one would ever come, that the galaxy had judged them weak, and had already written their deaths into history scrolls that would never be read by strangers. Still, a small few refused the comfort of despair, and gathered nightly beneath the towers, whispering that somewhere a listener would hear, that across the vast cold sea of stars there had to be one ear willing to answer. The children of Theron asked questions that stabbed into the hearts of their elders. They asked why no one cared, why the mighty empires of legend had turned away, and whether the stars held only cruelty and not kindness. The parents spoke softly, telling them to keep hope alive, for without hope nothing remained. Some nights mothers pointed to the constellations, and told stories of heroes yet unseen, promising that one day the ships would descend with thunder and fire, not to conquer, but to save. Though even as they spoke their eyes carried shadows of doubt, and the great city's crumbling towers stood against dust-filled winds. Markets once alive with colors became empty shells, and gangs prowled like wolves, scavenging for food and fuel. People whispered of leaving for the deep wilds, but there was nowhere to run, for the entire world was failing. Even the seas tasted of salt and death, and the skies brought no rain, only ash and storm. Still above it all, the signals carried on, never ceasing, never silent. Across the galaxy the great powers heard and dismissed Theron, as they had from the beginning. Council chambers filled with polished voices declared the world of no consequence. Their maps showed no resources worth the effort. Their calculations found no profit in mercy. Their pride refused to see value in fragile lives. They reasoned that to save Theron was to waste time and ships, and so they turned their eyes away, while an entire world starved. But not every ear in the galaxy belonged to the proud and the powerful. There were listeners on distant stations, hobbyists scanning the endless frequencies, dreamers who tracked the hum of forgotten stars, and in time the signals of Theron found their way to Earth, a young world, to the galaxy, yet one forged by storms and fire and struggle. A world whose people were called Death. When the Deathworlders heard the call, they did not turn away. On Earth, the signals of Theron were first discovered by accident on a listening station orbiting the outer rim of the Sol system, where technicians sifted through the endless static of the cosmos, searching for patterns or whispers of distant civilizations. The signal came weak, broken, and distorted, yet clear enough to carry the voice of despair that had echoed for years through the void. The technicians listened and felt the weight of those words, and for a long time there was silence in the control room, as they realized they were hearing the voice of a world on the edge of death. The message was analyzed, decoded, and replayed again and again, until it reached the ears of leaders, scientists, and generals, and it spread quickly across Earth. For humanity had long wondered if they were truly alone in the galaxy, and now they knew not only that others existed, but that those others were suffering and pleading for help. Many voices on Earth argued at once. Some called for caution, warning that it could be a trap. Others said it was not their concern, that humanity was still too fragile, too untested to risk its strength for strangers on a dying world. But among the voices there rose a stronger current, a belief that this was not a choice to ignore, that to hear such cries and do nothing would make them no better than the empires who had turned their backs on Theron. And that was something humanity could not bear, for the people of Earth knew struggle. They had been forged on a world of storms and quakes, of beasts and plagues. They were Deathworlders, as the galaxy would one day call them, and there, spirit had been sharpened by survival in council chambers across Earth. Debates raged, but again and again the conclusion was reached: if they could help, they must help, and so plans were drawn with urgency. Fleets were prepared, not fleets of conquest, but of mercy, filled with food supplies, medicine, engineers and soldiers who volunteered not for glory but to protect those who had no shield against the cruelty of the void. The factories of Earth roared with life as machines built relief modules, water purifiers and shelters. Entire nations contributed resources, working together as if the fate of Theron was the fate of their own world. The news spread quickly across human settlements and colonies, and with it came a wave of determination. Common people donated what they could. Engineers worked without rest. Pilots trained in new maneuvers designed for rapid aid deployment. Children painted symbols of hope to be carried aboard the ships when they departed. Even those who doubted the mission found themselves caught in the rising tide of conviction that this was the moment when humanity would show the galaxy who they truly were. And when the fleet stood ready, their hulls gleaming under the sun of Earth, their engines burning with power, the people watched from every shore and every city as they prepared to depart into the black beyond, carrying with them the promise that the cries of Theron would no longer go unanswered. The people of Theron had long since abandoned hope. When the day finally came, their skies had grown used to emptiness. No ships, no fleets, only storm clouds rolling across the horizon. But on that day the clouds split apart with fire as vast shapes descended from the void. The air trembled with the roar of engines unlike anything they had ever heard. The starving and broken gathered in the streets, staring upward, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief, for to them the arrival of ships in such numbers could only mean conquest and final ruin. The human fleet entered orbit with precision, their vessels bristling with strength, yet bearing colors and signals of peace. They deployed dropships that cut through the atmosphere, trailing fire. The people below screamed and fled, at first believing this was the end, raiders or empires come to take what little they had left. But when the dropships landed in the ruins of their cities, what stepped out was not an army of oppressors, but men and women clad in armor, carrying crates of food, medicine and water. They moved with discipline but also with gentleness, offering words the people could not understand, yet their actions spoke louder than language. At first, no one dared to approach. The memory of betrayal and abandonment had grown too heavy, but hunger has no fear, and soon, a child too weak to walk was carried forward by her mother, who fell to her knees before the towering humans. The soldiers knelt as well and placed food in her hands, water at her lips, and in that moment something shifted across the crowd. Disbelief turned into trembling hope, and voices cried out in awe that someone had finally come. The engineers of Earth began to work swiftly, setting up purification systems to cleanse the poisoned rivers, deploying generators to bring light back to shattered districts, and building shelters to protect against the storms. The soldiers stood guard not against the people but against the raiders and scavenger bands that had risen during the years of collapse. These bands tried to strike, but they found themselves driven back by Deathworlders who fought with a ferocity few had ever seen. Word spread across Theron faster than the winds. The Deathworlders had come, not as conquerors but as saviors. They asked for no tribute, they claimed no territory, they demanded no obedience. They only gave aid where aid was needed and protection where danger lurked. The people wept openly in the streets as food was handed out, as children ate until they were full. For the first time in their lives above the world, the great human fleet stood watch, its presence a shield against any who might seek to take advantage. And for the first time in countless years, the skies of Theron did not feel empty. They felt alive and filled with promise. The cries that had gone unanswered for so long had finally been heard, and the answer had come with thunder, fire, and mercy. Across the galaxy, the news of Earth's intervention on Theron spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of the great empires that had once ignored the cries, and in the halls of marble and steel debates erupted as leaders and advisors argued over what it meant that a small and previously insignificant world had thrown itself into the affairs of another civilization that had long been considered expendable. Some scoffed, calling it folly, a foolish attempt to gain influence with no resources to buffet. Others trembled with fear, wondering if Earth's Deathworlders were not simply saviors but a new force to reckon with. The human fleets were seen on sensors as they moved through orbit, and as they landed on Theron, other powers watched, closely calculating every action, every drop of aid delivered, and every soldier that stepped from the ships. They saw the strength of the Deathworlders in battle and in protection and the efficiency with which they restored order where chaos had reigned. They saw how quickly food and medicine reached the desperate and how swiftly the people of Theron began to trust in their new allies, and some realized with unease that Earth was not acting out of greed or conquest but out of something stranger, a kind of mercy that had no immediate profit and that made the threat greater than any fleet could measure in. Council chambers, spies, and diplomats scrambled to assess what could be done to contain or exploit the humans. Some suggested sending envoys with gifts and empty promises to gain favor. Others whispered of sabotage or blockade to prevent the Deathworlders from establishing permanent footholds. Yet the more they watched, the more they understood the futility of interference. The humans moved with unity and purpose, as if the needs of Theron were inseparable from the honor of their own world. They were disciplined and relentless, yet their actions were tempered with care and caution so that destruction was minimized, and lives preserved. The people of Theron did not understand the machinations of empires above them. They only knew that the humans had come when all others had turned away, and that their world was slowly healing in ways they could not have imagined. Crops were planted again, rivers were purified, generators brought water and light to ruined districts, and the people began to speak of hope in words they had long thought lost. They began to trust that the future could be different, that the past of neglect and abandonment did not have to define them. Meanwhile, Earth continued to send resources, reinforcements, and engineers, every action a signal to the galaxy that their arrival was permanent and intentional. And slowly, the other powers realized that to challenge the humans would not be simple, for the Deathworlders were not just warriors, they were strategists and survivors, hardened by storms, beasts, and harsh lands of their own, and they protected those who could not protect themselves. Without hesitation and without compromise, in the end the empires were forced to reconsider their assumptions about Theron and about Earth. A quiet fear settled among those who had ignored the cries of the weak, and a reluctant respect grew for a species that had answered when no one else would, and across the stars the name of humanity began to carry a weight it had never held before, and it was understood that the Deathworlders would not be denied or ignored. The world of Theron began to stir with life as the humans worked side by side with the people whose cries had gone unanswered for so long. The ruined cities that had once been nothing more than crumbling shells of despair now hummed with energy, as engineers and builders cleared debris, repaired structures, and erected new shelters sturdy and resilient against the storms that had long plagued the planet. Children ran through streets that smelled of fresh wood and clean water, laughing for the first time in years, while adults carried food and water, grateful for hands that helped without question or judgment everywhere. The humans went, they carried with them knowledge of survival, of engineering, of medicine that the people of Theron had never imagined. They taught farmers new ways to grow crops in poor soil, to conserve water, to protect animals from disease, and taught builders techniques that made homes stronger and safer against the relentless winds and rains. Some humans stayed to train local guards to patrol villages and towns, teaching them discipline and strategy, not for conquest but for protection. And soon bands that had terrorized the countryside found themselves challenged by a force they could not overcome. Even in the heart of the city's cultural exchanges flourished. The humans listened to the stories of the elders and learned the songs of the people. And in turn, the Thareners learned about the struggles and victories of the Deathworlders. The young children shared games with soldiers, the cooks shared meals and recipes, and slowly what had been a relationship of desperation became a partnership of trust and respect as bonds formed through shared effort and care. But not all was simple. The seasons brought storms that threatened to undo the progress, and natural disasters reminded everyone that Theron was still fragile. Yet the humans never wavered. They repaired bridges, swept streets, reinforced shelters, and ensured that food and water continued to reach even the most isolated villages. Their presence was a constant reassurance that hope was real, and that no cry would again go unanswered. People began to speak openly of the future, imagining schools, marketplaces, farms, and homes that could thrive. They celebrated festivals with both human and Tharena participation. Songs filled the air, drums echoed through rebuilt plazas, and children danced beneath newly constructed lights that glowed warmly against the darkening skies. Even those who had once doubted the arrival of help could not deny the transformation that was unfolding before their eyes. Through all this, the humans remained disciplined and watchful, not as overlords, but as guardians, ready to step forward at any sign of danger. Their presence alone deterred raiders and criminals. Their reputation as Deathworlders whose mercy was matched only by their strength grew across every district and village. The people of Theron whispered their names with gratitude and awe, knowing that their world had been given a second chance, and in that chance there was a profound shift. The silence that had once filled the void above Theron was replaced with voices, laughter, and movement, and a new hope that carried forward into the sky, as if the stars themselves had begun to shine brighter. For those who had been heard and saved by humans who had come when no one else would. For months, Theron seemed to breathe again as the humans and the people of the world worked together, rebuilding what had been lost. But the peace was not to last, as a storm, unlike any in living memory, formed over the western plains. Dark clouds, roiled with fury, winds howled across the valleys, and the rivers swelled beyond their banks, threatening villages that had only just begun to recover. The humans and Thariners watched with growing dread, knowing that the coming hours would test every skill, every lesson, and every ounce of courage they had learned together. The warning came from the orbital sensors first, detecting the approach of massive storms, followed by torrential rains that fell in sheets and lightning that split the sky. The human engineers immediately organized teams to reinforce levees, erect barriers, and evacuate the most vulnerable settlements, while soldiers and local guards coordinated rescue operations, moving people from flooded streets to temporary shelters built in the previous months. The children huddled with their families, listening to the wind and rain, and praying for safety and for those they had come to trust. As the storm struck the plains, it tore through fields, homes, and roads, uprooting trees and smashing structures with relentless force. Yet the humans moved without hesitation, braving the winds to carry the injured to safety, setting up makeshift hospitals and rationing food to ensure that no one would be left behind. The followed their lead, some with fear still in their hearts but growing courage in their hands. Together they worked side by side, carrying sandbags, repairing breaches, and calming the terrified, until the storm seemed almost alive with resistance and fury. Through the longest night the storm raged, and human and Thariner alike endured sleepless hours, exposed to the elements, guiding each other through darkness and mud and water, their voices calling out names, giving directions, offering comfort. For every cry of fear a hand was extended, a life was saved, a home preserved. Even when entire districts seemed lost, the fleet above maintained orbit, monitoring the disaster, deploying drones and landing supplies to keep the relief effort continuous. By dawn the clouds began to break, revealing the devastation left in the storm's wake. Entire valleys were submerged, bridges were destroyed, and fields washed away. But the people who had survived looked to one another and to the humans who had not faltered. And for the first time they felt not despair but determination. They saw what they could achieve together, and the bond between them solidified into something permanent, unshakable, and alive. The humans stayed even after the storm passed, not only repairing but improving the infrastructure, building stronger levees, wider canals, shelters elevated above flood zones, and planting resilient crops that could withstand the next storm. Their presence was no longer temporary. It had become a part of Theron itself, and the people spoke openly of gratitude, admiration, and trust, knowing that if the worst returned, the Deathworlders would stand with them without hesitation. And in that moment the world understood what it meant to be saved, not by chance, not by luck, but by beings who had come when no one else would, whose strength was tempered with care, whose mercy was matched with skill, whose presence transformed the cries of a forgotten people into a song of hope, rising across the storm-swept plains of Theron into the sky above and beyond. The world of Theron had changed forever. The skies were clear once more, the rivers flowed strong and steady, the fields began to bloom again, and the people walked through their cities not with fear but with purpose. Their eyes were open to possibilities that had seemed unimaginable only months before, and everywhere the presence of humans was felt, not as an occupation but as a promise kept, a hand extended when all others had turned away. Children laughed as they ran through the streets, playing games taught by soldiers, their voices ringing across the plazas, while elders shared stories of the past and of the humans who had come to their aid. A new generation of Thuriners grew up knowing that the stars were not indifferent, that somewhere out there were beings who could choose to listen and act, who could decide that mercy and courage were worth more than wealth or conquest. Humans themselves had grown attached to the world they had saved. The Deathworlders who had arrived, with fearsome reputations, softened as they taught and built and protected alongside the people of Theron. They had seen despair transformed into hope and destruction, transformed into life, and they too felt a bond that stretched beyond duty into friendship, respect, and pride for what they had accomplished together. The fleet that had once arrived with thunder now moved calmly above the world, a symbol of watchful guardianship. Not domination festivals were held across Theron, celebrating the recovery and the new alliances. The people painted murals, honoring the humans. Their songs carried the story of survival and courage. And in every village and city, children carried flowers and gifts to the soldiers and engineers who had saved them. Monuments were erected not only for the humans, but for the unity of effort and the triumph of hope over abandonment. Of the great powers of the galaxy, who had once ignored the calls of Theron, now watched with quiet respect, if not awe. They saw a world transformed not by force, but by discipline, care, and resolve, and they could not deny the growing reputation of humanity as Deathworlders, whose mercy was matched only by their strength. Some whispered in council chambers of caution, others of alliances, yet all knew that the balance of power had shifted in subtle ways that could not be ignored. The people of Theron themselves walked freely through the rebuilt cities. They farmed the lands with confidence. They drank from clean rivers. They studied the lessons taught by humans and shared their own wisdom. In return there was laughter and music and commerce and play. A life that had once seemed impossible now felt ordinary, in the best sense, ordinary in the sense that survival had become thriving, that fear had become hope, and that cries that had gone unanswered for so long had finally been heard and answered. And as the sun set over the mountains, casting gold and fire across the plains, the humans looked to the horizon, knowing that their work was not complete, but also knowing that the world they had saved would endure, that the people of Theron would remember their choice to come when no one else would, that across the galaxy a new story had begun, one of courage, compassion, and the understanding that even in the coldest emptiness voices of need could find those willing to answer. Reen would never forget, and neither would humanity, for in answering the cries of a dying world, the Deathworlders had not only changed another civilization but had also changed themselves, forging bonds across the stars, a testament to the power of mercy, courage, and the simple act of listening when no one else would.